Hello everyone, Leonard here from Drawplet, and I hope that your day is as bright and delightful as this mythical birch forest that we're going to paint today. So I was looking for some inspiration to post a tutorial and I came across a few birch forest pictures that look really nice. So I thought of recreating them with a touch of minimalist style to give it that magical foresty vibe. As we draw, there are two main things to take note. The first thing will be the thickness of the trees, and the second being the space between them. Subconsciously, we'll try to draw every tree with the same width and space them out evenly. But since nature is random, we'll place them more spontaneously, having some thicker trees in the foreground and some skinnier ones in the background just because they're further away. We'll also ensure that the distance between the trees differs slightly just to make them more natural. Try to draw little dots on the trees to mark them so you don't get confused between the trees and the background while you're painting. Moving on, the painting process will be divided into three main sections: the sky, the foliage, and the tree. We'll start with the sky first, but I'm also going to mix some of the foliage color in advance because we need to blend the colors where the sky meets the foliage later. I'm using lemon yellow and olive green for the lighter parts of the foliage and sap green, indigo red for the darker tones. I'm also using Prussian blue for the sky. I'm going to start painting the sky from top to bottom, and I try to be as precise as possible and paint within the lines. This will give you a cleaner outcome, which is something that I personally prefer. As we approach the part where the sky meets the foliage, I try to add some sap green into my Prussian blue to give it a more seamless blend. Repeat the same process for the next part of the sky, and this time we'll use a lighter green to blend the areas between the sky and the foliage. The reason we're using light green this time is just to make sure it's random and more natural. Continue to color the rest of the sky, keeping in mind that some parts stretch longer than the others, depending on how far or close the trees are. Generally, trees that are thicker have a longer stretch of color because they are closer. Take some time to digest that as we continue painting. Once we're done with the sky, we'll work on the foliage. I decided to have the light source coming in from the top right, so that will be my guide while coloring the shades of the foliage. Start with the lightest shade of green mix and color them in small strokes to give you that leafy texture. Work really wet so we're able to do some wet on wet techniques for the shade later. Notice that I'm also coloring around the trees, and the area where the tree meets the foliage doesn't have to be a flat line simply because it will look fake. While the light green foliage is still wet, we'll come in with some darker green mix on the bottom and let some of the dark colors bleed into the light green using wet on wet. Take note that the darker colors will eventually spread out, so what you see right now will not reflect the actual outcome of what it is after it has dried. Try not to overdo it, because once the foliage is covered in dark green, it's going to be hard to salvage the lighter areas, so less is better in this case. Continue the process for the foliage, taking into consideration the light source, and you should end up having a nice foliage filled with light and mid-tone greens. Next, we'll mix some really dark greens using the same red, indigo and sap green combo for the darker shadows. Try to work drier so there's more pigments and less water in your brush, making it way darker. Once again, keep it simple and just add more dark greens to the bottom left of the foliage where it's against the light source. You can also have 1 or 2 patches of dark greens on the brighter parts of the foliage just to make it more natural and spontaneous. Now that the foliage is complete, we'll move on to paint the birch trees. I'm mixing red and olive green to get a brownish earth tone, and just add a drop of indigo to mute it down a little. Try to have a diluted pool and a concentrated pool on your palette, so we can choose between dark and light tones while painting later. This is particularly important, especially if you're using a lot of wet on wet. Try to work really wet and light as we paint the first layer of the birch tree. Paint some mid-tones at the bottom of the tree for shadows, and add some random spots on the body of the tree to give it some texture. Remember to take note of the light source while painting. This will help you to understand why most of the shadows are concentrated on the left side of the tree trunk. I'm keeping some white space on this thicker tree to bring out the lighter tones even more. This will add more contrast to my painting as a whole, and you can just outline the side of the tree to give it some shadow too. Continue painting the rest of the trees using the same method that we have talked about. Right now, we're going to darken the shadows by adding another layer of the same mix. Wet the bottom part of the trees with clear water first, so we can use wet on wet to blend the darker shadows in. It's better to wet the trunk up to the middle section, so there's more allowance for the pigment to spread out. Try to work faster so the water doesn't dry out before you lay your dark colors. Now that everything has dried, it does seem that it's a tone lighter than what it was. This is usually the case for watercolor, so we'll just have to add dark tones again to emphasize the shadows even more. Since the light source is coming from top right, shadows are on the left and the bottom for all the trees. I'll paint the trees that are in the background even darker to show that they are further away. This will give your painting a sense of depth. Now that we're done with the tree trunk, it's time to go in with the fine details to give the birch trees their signature stripes. Use a really fine brush for this part. Remember to consciously remind yourself to paint more randomly while doing this. So instead of having stripes that are distributed evenly on the left and the right of the tree trunk, try to have some painted in the middle or just some random dots here and there just to make it more natural. This is my favorite part because you will start to see the trees come alive as you give them their texture. Now that we're almost done with this piece, add some black to the darkest areas just to make the picture pop even more. I decided to add some shadows on the tree trunks right beneath some of the texture to give it some 3D effect. And we are done. Here's a recap of what we managed to do today. Always keep in mind the light source while we're painting. Try to work really wet in the initial layers so we can achieve a smoother blend with wet on wet. Come in with the fine details last, and always try to ensure that your picture has a good dark, mid and light tone so it doesn't look flat. I hope that you have enjoyed this tutorial, and let me know what was the hardest part for you while attempting this piece. Keep calm, keep painting, and I'll see you next time.